Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here to give you my detailed image quality breakdown from the new Viltrox 85mm F1.8. Now, this is the manual focus version of the lens. Autofocus version should be released somewhere in the near future. We'll find out if there's anything different optically. It doesn't seem like it's optically different from the lens from what I can tell from the specifications, but we'll see when I get it hands-on. But today we're going to take a look and see how this lens that runs under $300 US, if this is a valid alternative for those that, maybe want a budget portrait lens for their Sony full frame mirrorless camera, or you could also shoot it on APS-C obviously, but it's really designed specifically for full frame. So we're going to jump in and we're going to take a look at the resolution, distortion, vignette, chromatic aberrations, bokeh quality, flare resistance, all of that good stuff. So let's see what we find when we really dig into the image quality from the Viltrox 85mm F1.8. Okay, we're going to take a look first of all at the distortion and vignette. So as you can see here, looking at the left side, the vignette is significant, and there is also a fairly significant amount of pincushion distortion, which you can see bulging down here and bulging down from the top. Now, what you can see on the right side is a manual correction that I've done, and I think that there is a argument to be made for doing manual correction that I'll demonstrate here in a moment. Now, I want to point you to something else first, and that is that you see that the software actually identifies this lens as the Sony FE 85mm F1.8. And so as a result, if we jump over into the develop module, you can see that you do have the option of going to enabling profile corrections and putting in the profile correction for the Sony 85mm. Now that does a fairly decent job, as you can see, of correcting vignette. Not perfect, but does a fairly good job, and you could you have some measure of control over that. So let's say that if I went something like this, but you can also see that the vignette pattern isn't identical, and so the extreme corners are not getting quite enough light. But if you go all the way, what ends up happening is that the center is maybe getting over brightened, and so that's a problem. And also you can see that the Viltrox obviously has significantly more pincushion distortion than there is latitude for correction in that profile. And so for that reason, I don't think that this is the best approach. It's better than nothing, and so on the fly it may help. But here you can see I've done a manual correction. And so what I've done here is I've plugged in a -9. You can see that that's done a much better job of straightening out the lines. It's not perfect, but it's close enough for most settings. A little bit of remaining pincushion distortion can be flattering in a portrait situation, so not the end of the world if you're shooting portraits. If you're shooting straight lines, that is a problem. Now on the vignette front, you can see I've plugged in a +66, so about 2 stops, but you can see the midpoint is way over, and so it's almost to the end. So it's a fairly significant amount of vignette, but also it creeps fairly far into the center of the frame. Now here, if we compare a RAW file brought in and then a JPEG shot at the same time, so it's the same shot, we can see that I don't know that there's a whole lot of correction going on in camera. I don't think that a profile is actually being applied. I think it's the software that identifies it as the Sony 85mm. So we can see that the vignette is basically uncorrected. And as far as whatever profile I've applied on import, I think the color palette is a little bit better. But that does give you an idea of how JPEGs look out of camera there. You will also note that there is definitely some chromatic aberration, some purple fringing, and you can see it's not really any different in the JPEG versus the RAW file, which tells us that there isn't actually any correction that is taking place there. Now, taking a look at a comparison here is the Tamron 85mm F1.8 VC. It's a lens that I happen to have on hand, and so I used it with the Sigma MC11 adapter here. So it gives us a comparison point, a similar 85mm F1.8 lens. So it doesn't identify quite perfectly for the reason of using the Sigma adapter. Now what we see here is that the Tamron definitely has less distortion. This is uncorrected here, and it also has less vignette. It's also metered a little bit different here, and so it's gone with a faster shutter speed. So it's arguably metered a bit better. We'll see. Taking a look in the center of the frame as far as the sharpness goes, you can see that the lenses really are more similar than different. There's probably a little bit more contrast for the Tamron in the center of the frame, but they're not radically different. Pretty good results from both. If you move off center, however, the Tamron has a much more even sharpness profile, and so you can see it's got much better sharpness and contrast at the edge of the frame. And of course less vignette allows it to have a better appearance of sharpness and resolution as well. And so very close in the center of the frame, but if you go off center, you definitely see an advantage for the Tamron. Now, an interesting thing happens when you stop down to f2. First of all, you can see that there is a fairly significant amount of vignette lift that takes place. And so, it's worth shooting at f2 if you're concerned about vignette, because you're not losing much light, but you actually eliminate a lot of the vignette issue. What's more intriguing, however, is the fact that it metered the exact same, as you can see, still at 1/4000th of a second. But for some reason, I'm suspecting it's because of the vignette, that the image on the right actually looks brighter. And so my recommendation is that you actually shoot this lens as an f2 lens rather than an f1.8 lens. You're not really losing any light on a practical level, but you do gain, less vignette. It hasn't changed a whole lot in terms of the optical performance, in terms of sharpness and contrast, but it has made a serious difference when it comes to the actual amount of vignette and thus no loss of light. So you can see image quality is fairly close. It looks a little bit better along the edges because of that fairly significant vignette lift, a surprising amount for such a small closing of aperture. But you can see that it definitely gives you a net positive, even if the lens isn't radically sharper from that stop down. Now, if we move on to f2.8, you can see that vignette has now essentially ceased to be an issue. It's almost completely eliminated. You can also see that there's definitely an uptick in contrast and sharpness in the center of the frame. If we start to move off center, it's starting to get better here. You can see, looking at in this grout line, definitely a lot more resolution and contrast. And in this area here, this is actually looking really crisp. And so sharpness profile really starting to extend towards the edges. And even the very corner and edge looks pretty decent. So we've got pretty good sharpness now at f2.8. If we hop back to compare with the Tamron for a moment, again, the Tamron is metering a little bit differently. I would guess that the actual correct metering result is somewhere right in between these two, which, we're dealing with 1/3 of a stop. And so they're kind of just splitting the difference. I don't know that one is particularly better than the other. If we're looking in the center of the frame, Viltrox actually is looking quite good now by comparison. Not necessarily significantly better, but certainly no worse, and arguably a little bit better in terms of the contrast near the center of the frame. Moving off center, down here the Tamron is definitely looking stronger yet, and so it's got a more even sharpness profile. But for portrait work, center of the frame, Viltrox is arguably just as good at this point. Now, if we move on in the aperture range, f4 and f5.6, we can see that center of the frame, we've continued to see improvement, and even at f5.6, there's further improvement. You look at how great the resolution and contrast looks like in all of these textures, so that's really good stuff there. And looking at the corner of the frame, we can see that now we've got nice looking resolution even to the the very edges of the frame, and so it's very, very sharp at f5.6. Now, one area where Viltrox does have an advantage is when it comes to the geometry of the bokeh circles. You can see that even at f1.8, everything is really nice and circular here across the whole frame. With the Tamron, you can definitely see more deformation. It's cat eye, lemon shaped, going towards the edges. Zooming in here to our actual subject, which, by the way, this gives you a look at what maximum magnification is for the Viltrox. The Tamron frame's a little bit tighter. It's a little bit longer than 85mm, as I've seen in other tests. What we can see here is that Viltrox actually looks really good in terms of the contrast center of the frame. There is a tiny, tiny bit of purple fringing, right here on both of them. One looking no different than the other. Difference, though, is on the Tamron, there's very little green fringing after the plane of focus, whereas there's a noticeable amount here on the Viltrox. Now, looking here at the center, contrast for both of them looks about the same. As we move on towards the bottom, as we've seen before, the Tamron's definitely stronger towards the edge of the frame. And if you move off into the corner, that's even more obviously the case. Now, if we stop on down to f2.8, you can see now the circular shape is more similar with the two of them. You're seeing a tiny bit of aperture blade shape on some of this, but for the most part, it's still very, very circular, and so a good result there. If we zoom in now, the Tamrons continue to pick up more contrast here, so neither one of them are showing much of purple fringing there. There's still some green fringing, however, on the Viltrox, and of course, there wasn't really any there to begin with on the Tamron, and so it looks better there. Now, Viltrox looks more competitive maybe in this zone. However, if we move off to the corner of the frame, it's not as good. Moving on the right side, it's a little bit more competitive on this side, maybe just a little slightly very, very slight centering advantage for the right side over the left, so a tiny bit of decentering perhaps. Here's a real-world scene, very, very challenging scene because of the lighting, very, very bright snow and then very, very dark branches. And so I've seen that this is a torture chamber for chromatic aberrations. What we can see is there's great resolution and contrast here for this landscape type scene across a good part of the frame and even here towards the edge. Now you can see there is a little bit of maybe some lateral chromatic aberration, just tiny amounts, a little bit of green and purple, almost undetectable there, and not too bad even in this, this is a really tough transition zone here. And so overall, not too bad. Looking over at this side of the frame, you can see a little bit of that green and purple, but it's so minute as to be essentially a non-factor. One more look at the kind of the chromatic aberrations is that you can see comparing f1.8 to f2.8, really wide open contrast and resolution looks quite good on our main subject here. I mean, there's lots of detail there, nothing to complain about. We can see that the chromatic aberrations are a little bit more pronounced on the left side, but not by much. And so unfortunately in this case, stopping down, in fact, let's take it a step further and let's look at F4. Now, F4, there's a little less of the green fringing, but it's more because depth of field is increasing. So unfortunately, chromatic aberrations, while they're not like out of control or anything, they do persist in some, very challenging high contrast situations. But as we'll see, not in every situation. In this scene, we've got easier lighting, less high contrast lighting. And so even though we've got a bright transition on the dog's nose from, the white fur to the dark fur, you're not really seeing any issues with chromatic aberration. Everything looks pretty good. And even going into the bokeh area, I don't really see a whole lot of bokeh fringing showing up. So not a real issue with that there. In this zone right here, this is wide open and close to minimum focus. Bokeh actually looks really nice and creamy. No real hard edges being picked up there. We'll see that transition zone's a little tougher for this lens, but in this kind of setting, it does really fabulous. Here's another scene, maybe about 6 feet, couple of meters to the primary subject here. And so you can see, detail is good here. We've got a little bit of green fringing in this transition zone, but again, overall the scene looks pretty nice. Bokeh looks fairly soft, and that's definitely a credible image. Now as we start to head towards transition zone with difficult objects. Now I will have to tell you that something about this image, even though it's a little bit busy in some places, kind of the bokeh chaos of it on an artistic level does appeal to me. Here we have really good detail on our subject. I think this is at f2. Everything looks good, and in this case, fringing doesn't look too bad. Again, because the lighting isn't as dramatic, as harsh, and this area is a little bit busy, so you can see that it does struggle a little in the transition zone. Again, something about the image itself I actually like. This image, I think, really highlights where I think the problem is, and that's in that transition zone. You're starting from about here on, as the depth of field gets deeper, the bokeh gets softer. But in that zone of maybe, somewhere around 6 to 10 feet, there is definitely some just, kind of busyness that is picked up. This doesn't like melt away in a creamy fashion. So I think that's where the limitations of the bokeh rendering are. Now here is an f1.8 portrait, and I think that the lens has actually pulled this off really nicely. First of all, colors look good. There's plenty of detail actually on all of the faces there, And as you can see, looking down at like the texture of the denim and the skirt, there's good information in the texture. Everything looks, everything looks good there. There's a little bit of that transition zone busyness here, but not enough to, and over here, not enough to really grab the eye. And this, all the rest of this actually looks quite nice. If I stop down to f2.8, I have increased a little bit of, resolution and detail, but it was already quite good to begin with. And if anything, the transition zone is probably, as depth of field has increased, this transition zone is actually a little bit smoother. Lady walking her dog, she's, nicely, kind of blended away to out of focus. So once again, as a budget portrait lens, this is a fairly commendable one. And of course, also the aspect of video, which we'll detail more in the final review. Certainly nothing to complain about on this kind of focus distance. Everything has, melted away really nicely in the bokeh. This is f2.8. We can see that skin tones look nice. I do think that they're a little bit warm here. That could also be a white balance thing. I haven't necessarily noticed a trend of it always being warmer, and so it may just be this particular image. But I will note that skin tones themselves actually look quite good. They're natural looking. They're not, waxy or plasticky. And so, once again, as a budget portrait lens, that's a strength. Final thing we'll look at here is actually flare resistance. And so you can see at f1.8, we've got this kind of big halo type effect, but not a lot of other artifacts. So I suspect that's something you might be able to use to, artistic benefit. Stopping down to f11 allows you to see the aperture, blade shape coming out. There are, some of these ghosting artifacts, but at the same time, contrast, actually on both images, contrast away from the epicenter of the light source has held up fine. In this case, you can see, you've got some of these, kind of prismatic effects here and a little bit of ghosting, but again, not overly destructive. And so I'm not going to call that really a bad performance, particularly for an 85mm lens with a moderately wide aperture, as 85mm lenses often struggle with something like this. So as you can see, a little bit of a mixed bag, but I would say more positives than negatives. It's certainly a competitive lens. It's not one of these budget lenses to where the image quality is garbage from it. Certainly it is much stronger in the center of the frame than what it is on the corners of the frame at wide apertures. But if you stop it down a little bit, we see that sharpness extends right to the edges. And by the time you get to like landscape apertures, it's really quite a sharp lens. The bokeh quality is also fairly decent, other than a little bit in the transition zone in certain images. There are chromatic aberrations, particularly when the lighting situation is, more harsh, higher contrast. But at the same time, it's not so terrible that it's, really damaging, and certainly no worse than, lenses like Canon's 85mm f1.8, which has similar levels of chromatic aberration, I would say. A little more pincushion distortion than what I like, a little more vignette wide open, but we saw that if you shoot it at f2, you actually end up with very little consequences for stopping it down. You end up with a lot of net positives, I would say. So certainly it is a worthy portrait lens on a budget, and of course being on, on Sony full frame mirrorless with all the manual focus aids, manual focus is not all that much of a challenge with it as well. In our final episode, we'll look at how actually that manual focus ring and the nature of the lens might make it the better choice if you are a video shooter or want to do hybrid video rather than waiting for the STM autofocus version of the lens that is yet to come. It looks like it'll ring in for about 80 bucks more, so still certainly quite a bargain, but significantly more than what this particular lens is. And so stay tuned for that, and I'll wrap things up, give you my final conclusion in that episode that is upcoming. Thanks for watching today. If you'll look in the description down below, there is a linkage to my image gallery if you want to see more photos than what we've seen in this episode. You can also find buying links if you'd like to purchase one for yourself. There is opportunities there to follow me on social media, including now on Instagram, to become a patron and get sneak previews in advance of upcoming content, along with other goodies. And of course, if you haven't already, please click that subscribe button right here on YouTube. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.